good morning. We're just going to wait for a couple of minutes to make sure everyone has arrived, and I'm just going to mute myself while that happens, and then we'll get started. Okay, good morning everybody. Thank you very much for joining us for this morning's webinar. This is the second Creative Literacy 101 webinar. My name's Becky and I'm a project manager at Judys Bicycle, and I'm also here with my colleagues Farah and Kiara, who are there in the background. They're going to be helping out with the webinar today. They'll be there in the background whilst I do the presentation, and then Kiara is going to be joining me for the question and answer session at the end. And if you have any technical issues, you can send a message to Farah in the chat section, and she'll be able to help you out as we go along. Okay, so before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping. Throughout the webinar, as I just mentioned, if anyone has a technical issue, you can use the chat to message Farah directly, but if you have a question about the content, there's a question and answer icon at the bottom of the Zoom window. So when you click on this, you can type and send your question. This means that all the questions will be there in place at the end, and we'll try and answer as many of them between us as we can. Also, if you have any kind of general thoughts or comments that you'd like to share with everybody that's here today, you can share those in the general chat as well as we go along. We will be recording the webinar and posting it on the JB website and it will also be subtitled as well. And the slides will be sent to everyone that's here today and that has signed up. Okay, so thank you for tuning into this introductory webinar. This is almost a repeat of the one that we did last week, and then following on from this we'll be having some subject deep dives, so you can put those dates in your diary now. We've got the 2nd of July and the 9th of July, and at the end of today's webinar we will be asking you your thoughts on what you'd like those deep dive webinars to be on, so do make sure that you fill out that poll towards the end, and we'll be announcing very soon what those will be. So we've organised these webinars because we know a lot of people coming into climate change for the first time can find it quite daunting, and even if you've been taking environmental action for quite a while, it can sometimes be quite useful to have a bit of a refresher or hear someone explain things in a different way, and get some inspiration for how to take this information back to your teams and the people you work with and your audiences. We thought that we'd run these webinars at the moment because we're in a huge break from what we are normally doing, and we'll be rebuilding from there for a long time. So how we rebuild and what we invest in as we rebuild is going to lock us into a path for many years to come. That's what people are speaking about when they talk about a green recovery. So I thought it would be helpful to start by understanding a little bit about who's in the audience. So I'm going to launch, or Farah is going to launch a poll for us, and if you could select one of the answers below about what best describes your role in your current organisation. Okay, we've almost got all the answers in now. So that's interesting to see that the majority of the audience today are Arts Council England funded organisations that are responsible for the environmental reporting requirements. And we've got 3 green champions, which is brilliant, and also some people that are here to just get a better understanding of some environmental issues. So hopefully we'll cover off all of your needs in today's presentation. Okay, great. So just to start off, I'm just going to give a bit of background to Judys Bicycle and the Arts Council England programme. So I know some of you will be familiar with this already, so please do bear with me, those of you that are. But just for those that aren't so familiar, at Judys Bicycle, our vision is a creative community powering action on climate change. So we were founded in 2007 from within the UK music industry to respond to the climate crisis. And we've now been working globally with the creative and cultural arts sector for over 10 years. So we support and empower the sector to reduce emissions by taking bold practical action which is founded in science, catalysing the green creative economy, and advocating to and for culture publicly speaking out, using creativity to inspire audiences and the wider movement at this most crucial time in tackling the climate crisis. So our cultural and scientific expertise, coupled with our sector leadership, enable us to deliver a unique training, consultancy, certification, research and thought leadership. One big project that we work on that spans all of these areas is our partnership with Arts Council England. We've been working with the Arts Council to deliver their environmental programme since 2012, and this webinar is a specific output of that programme. Through the partnership, we help Arts Council England funded organisations to report on their environmental impacts and support arts organisations to take action. So you can find more information about the programme in our latest annual report, and there are case studies in there from all organisations of all types and sizes about the action that they've been taking and some of the trends that we are seeing from the sector. Some of the outcomes of the programme, we found that engagement with environmental sustainability has had multiple benefits for arts organisations, from energy efficiency and carbon reduction through to improving team morale, new partnerships and collaborations, and what we call a new creative economy, so new ways of working, creating different ways of thinking about how arts organisations relate to their local and global communities, and the reputational benefits that come with that. So the data that you all provide us with helps us to better understand the carbon footprint of the arts in the UK. Which leads us on nicely to the first part of our content for today, which is what is a carbon footprint. So a carbon footprint is basically the measure of a climate change impact of an activity, product, person, country, venue, or an event, for example. The most common way that climate change impacts are measured is in kilograms or tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent, and in order to get to grips with what that actually means, I'm just going to start with a little bit of science. So when we talk about the climate change impact, what we're really talking about is greenhouse gas emissions. For those of you that already know this, please do bear with me, but we'll just touch on it briefly. So greenhouse gases are gases that trap heat in the atmosphere. So if there were no greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, Earth would not be warm enough to sustain life as we currently experience it, and we know it. So the atmosphere traps these greenhouse gases in a heat layer around the Earth, a bit like a greenhouse. So when we talk about global warming, what we're actually referring to is an enhanced greenhouse effect, or man-made global warming, which has been accelerating since the beginning of the industrial age, where our burning of fossil fuels has been releasing excess greenhouse gas emissions, mainly carbon dioxide, or CO2 into the atmosphere, trapping more and more heat. So we're going to do another poll now to get your thoughts on what you think is the biggest source of man-made greenhouse gas emissions in the world. So the options are electricity and heat, transportation, industrial processes, agriculture, or land use change and deforestation. Just give you a few moments to have a think about that one. Okay, so quite mixed results, but most of you decided that transportation was the biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions, and then land use change and agriculture came quite close next up. And interestingly, only 8% of you thought electricity and heat was the largest source of emissions. So I'm going to reveal the correct answer, which is electricity and heat. So that accounts for around a third of emissions. More if you count the energy use in manufacturing and construction. Transportation is around 16%, and agriculture is around 12%, and land use change again is 6 to 7%. So that's quite an interesting reflection. Okay, so climate change impact is how much greenhouse gases is this activity, project, event, or item producing. So these are some of the main greenhouse gases that we release into the atmosphere, and these are the main ones that are regulated under international policy as well. So the first one is the one we're all probably most familiar with, carbon dioxide. It's probably the most important greenhouse gas, as it's the vast majority of what comes from burning fossil fuels for energy, for electricity, heat, transport, manufacturing, construction. So basically, over millions of years, plants used the sun's energy to capture carbon from the air, and then they were buried and turned into fossil fuels. And now, in just a period of a short few decades, we're using all of that energy and releasing all of that carbon back into the air. Some carbon emissions do also come from land use change, so things like deforestation making way for either agricultural production or urban expansion, for example. And some industrial processes like cement manufacture produce carbon dioxide through chemical reactions in one of the production stages. So CO2 is a very long-lived greenhouse gas, which means that when we emit it into the atmosphere, it can stick around for hundreds of years, continuing to heat the earth throughout that life cycle. So the next one down is methane. Not many people are aware, but it's actually 25 times stronger than carbon dioxide, but it's slightly less long-lived. So methane stays around in the atmosphere for more like around 10 years. It leaks from fossil fuel production, like gas wells, and famously cow farts, which is what most people know it to come from. It's also released from food and other organic matter, decomposing in landfills and in flooded rice paddies. The next one is nitrous oxide. This one is 300 times stronger than carbon dioxide, so an extremely powerful greenhouse gas. It's generally released from the soil, and the way we manage that soil, including how much fertilizers are used on the land. And the last one is F gases. So scarily, these are 23,000 times more impactful than CO2, and some of them are especially long-lived. So these are the man-made replacements for gases that were destroying the ozone layer. So things like that were used in refrigerants and air conditioning, aerosols. But it turns out that a lot of them are actually really good at trapping heat in the atmosphere. So that's one of the reasons why these products and how we dispose of them is really highly regulated. When we talk about carbon footprints, you often see CO2e with a small little e after the CO2, which stands for equivalent. So it means that the warming power of the other greenhouse gases that aren't carbon dioxide have been captured and converted into carbon to help us to compare the climate impact of different types of greenhouse gases. And ultimately, the thing that really matters is carbon dioxide and the burning of fossil fuels for energy. Okay, so where are we now? All of these extra greenhouse gases means that global heating has already reached 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So 1 or 2 degrees might not sound like very much, but our complex interconnected society has never existed before outside of these temperature bounds. So when our agricultural society started, which was around 10,000 years ago, the Holocene in that graph, which you'll see along the top there, and temperatures during the Holocene, as you can see, have been very stable. The other thing is that the average warming of 1 degree, or 1.5 or 2 degrees, is not the same everywhere across the world. So temperatures increase at different speeds in different places. For example, there's a lot more warming over land, which happens to be where we live. So the Paris Agreement is an international agreement. Most governments in the world signed up to it in 2016 to limit warming to below 2 degrees C, or better yet, 1.5 degrees C, which would be safer. The ambitious 1.5 degrees C was introduced quite late in the process. At that point, scientists hadn't really studied the difference that tiny half a degree would make. But it was pushed mainly by low-lying island states and other nations from the global south who knew that half a degree would make a huge difference to their people, in some cases whether or not that country would go underwater. So it's really important to emphasise that every tiny fraction of a degree matters. So the proportion of people in the world exposed to severe heat waves could double. If you compare 1.5 to 2 degrees C, this is. The average drought length would double, and the proportion of people in the world exposed to water scarcity would also double. Habitat loss doubles, and at 1.5 degree, tropical corals could survive, but if we increase that to 2 degrees C, they would completely disappear. Climate change is what we call a risk multiplier. So climate change is also one of the 9 planetary boundaries, where if we cross the threshold, we drive Earth into the whole Earth system into a completely different state altogether. We control how many emissions go into the atmosphere. Then when those emissions cause higher temperatures, they cause changing weather patterns, more flooding, droughts, food insecurities, displacement of people. Some of them are predictable and some of them are unpredictable. So we don't necessarily know at what point some of these environmental and social impacts will come into play. How resilient are our political, economic, social and cultural systems really to deal with these risks? It's a big question that we're asking ourselves due to coronavirus at this moment. So this brings me on to the fact that climate change is not merely a singular issue or environmental problem. It's a question of power, politics, justice and access. This slide shows how important it is that we think about climate change as a systemic issue. It's one that's rooted in our culture, lifestyles, the systems our societies are built on and locked into, the way that we consume energy, food, fashion, the way that we behave, travel, work and engage with one another. So the root cause of climate change are not technologies such as coal or chemically intensive agriculture, but the underlying social and cultural systems that created and locked people into these technologies through unsustainable patterns of consumption, growth and inequity. Climate justice is a term that we use for framing global warming as an ethical and political issue, rather than one that is purely environmental or physical in nature. This is done by relating the effects of climate change to concepts of justice, particularly environmental justice and social justice, by examining issues such as equality, human rights, collective rights, and the historical responsibilities of climate change. That's why climate change intersects with everything else, from women's access to education to the health and well-being of communities. The most disadvantaged people in the world, who are generally responsible for the least emissions, are also the most vulnerable to its impacts all across the world, not just in the global south, but also, for example, those who can't afford to run air conditioning in a heat wave in the US. So where are we going? Unfortunately, we are still a long way from limiting warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius. We're actually currently on a pathway to possibly over 3 degrees, and at current rates of warming we'll get to 1.5 degrees well within the next 3 decades. We have until 2050 at the absolute latest to reach zero carbon emissions globally, and getting us back on track is only possible if we start reducing right now and reduce by half by 2030. These numbers are based on analysis that has been done by the IPCC, or Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, who released 3 reports last year which summarise all of the climate science for policymakers. And those reports emphasised that the current 10 years that we're living in are absolutely crucial. So why this urgency? So CO2 accumulates in the atmosphere over time, and we sometimes think of climate change as a sort of historic problem that's come from the Industrial Revolution, but unfortunately climate change is still accelerating. So more than half of emissions have been released in the last 30 years, which is since Rick Astley released Never Gonna Give Up You Up, or Phantom of the Opera was first released on Broadway, just to put that into context. So as long as our annual emissions are not down to net zero, we're still increasing the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. Every delay means deeper and faster cuts will be needed, because we'll have used up more of our remaining carbon budget. We'll be depending more on negative emissions, which is capturing carbon through nature, or such as tree planting or technology. And those solutions can only do so much. There's a much higher risk of an overshoot or reaching a tipping point, and adaptation to the impacts of our changing climate will become more and more difficult as time goes on. So let's just briefly have a look at what we mean by net zero. So when we talk about net zero, we're basically talking about reducing emissions as much as possible and balancing out the rest with negative emissions. So those negative emissions can either be from nature, so things like planting trees and restoring peatlands, or they can be technological, such as carbon capture and storage, and direct air removal technologies that suck carbon right from the air. Where models see some role for them is usually to help address emissions from areas that are much harder to deal with, such as flying. But we really shouldn't be using the possibility of negative emissions as a reason not to reduce emissions. Reducing emissions first needs to be the priority. So climate scenarios see a limited role for these technological approaches, because there's a limit to how much land, for example, that we can plant trees on. And the technological solutions that we need don't currently exist at scale. So we won't get to where we need to go without some really big emissions cuts. So I'm just going to talk to you about some different policies, both from the UK and internationally, which are focused on climate action. So first of all, there's the UN Paris Agreement, So under the UN Paris Agreement, the UK has to submit what we call nationally determined contribution, which is a long-winded way of saying a plan to how we're going to reduce our emissions. The UK Climate Change Act was originally introduced in 2008, and last year the UK updated the Climate Change Act to have a legally binding target of net zero by 2050. Sounds like a really good start, but is it enough? We need to get to global net zero by 2050, but how should these cuts be distributed? There's a strong case from an equity perspective that high emitters and industrialised countries who have contributed the majority of historical emissions, such as the UK, should get to net zero much faster than the rest of the world, perhaps a decade or more faster. This would mean achieving emissions reductions a lot higher than has ever been achieved by any country. So everything really does matter. It's not about the target itself, but whether the policy and action are actually there to make the reductions happen. We can have the most ambitious target in the world, but it doesn't mean much without a concrete plan of how we're going to get there and a policy. On that last slide as well, I was just going to mention that we've seen a real explosion in different UK boroughs, cities, city councils that have declared a climate emergency. So different cities are setting ambitious targets and action plans to get to carbon neutral or net zero. And they're undertaking a high level of citizen engagement, consultation and public participation. So how are the UK doing? The good news is that we're making great progress in decarbonising the electricity grid. So the UK has seen the fastest decarbonisation in the world, with emissions falling by 29% since 2010. At the same time, GDP has risen by a fifth. These emissions reductions are mainly due to coal consumption, which has been reduced by 80% over the last decade. So 54% of electricity generation in the UK is now from low carbon sources, 37% is from renewable energy, and 20% from wind. So you can see that sector there on the graph is the red line for power, and how emissions from power have fallen really fast. The not so good news is that the progress in reducing emissions from power is hiding the failure to reduce emissions in other sectors. So you can see there on the graph, other sectors such as transport and agriculture have really remained relatively stable in terms of their emissions over the last 10 years or so. A new study by WWF and the University of Leeds estimates that nearly half of UK emissions are not captured in official government figures because of the way these international scopes are agreed. So things like emissions associated with produce that we consume that's imported from elsewhere in the world, and emissions from aviation. If those emissions are included, we've actually only reduced by about 15% since 1990, not over 40%. So renewable energy tends to be a large part of any discussion on climate change and available solutions. So for a definition, renewable energy refers basically to energy that comes from sources that are inexhaustible or can't be used up. So natural energy sources such as wind, solar or tidal energy. There's also energy from the earth such as geothermal, or there's biomass as well. So renewable energy doesn't include low carbon, like relatively low carbon sources of power such as nuclear power, but renewables hold massive potential in their contribution to reducing emissions. And we've seen a real growth in the uptake of renewables in the last decade or so. So for example, solar installations have increased by 4,300% in the decade from 2007 to 2017. There's also renewable heat technologies. So these are the types of solutions that can be fitted to homes, such as solar thermal PV, and air source heat pumps and ground source heat pumps. These can be fitted to homes that are suitably insulated to make them into efficient buildings that don't rely on gas or fossil fuel power. Sometimes renewable energies can be less sustainable or a bit controversial, so there can be a trade-off in terms of habitat loss or poorly executed projects which don't plan well for social or economic outcomes, such as controversial large tidal schemes or mega dams. Bioenergy is another renewable that is a bit controversial due to competition with land for food production or habitat conservation. And some instances emission savings might not be as high as other forms of renewable energy, such as offshore wind or solar. So this graph is from the Committee on Climate Change Roadmap to Net Zero. So this basically plots out what needs to happen within each decade in each sector to get to zero carbon by 2050. So a few of the most relevant to the creative businesses are highlighted here. So first of all, if we take electricity, we need to decarbonise electricity. So that means more renewable energy that as we were just talking about. So we need to invest in energy efficiency for buildings, shift away from gas heating, for example through investment in heat pumps. By the 2030s, there should be widespread electrification of heating. So if you're going to do big capital projects now for future-proofing buildings, that's a really important thing to consider. If we move down to road transport, in the 2020s we need to ramp up the electrical EV market, make decisions on heavy goods vehicles. This is relevant in terms of providing car charging points for audiences and thinking ahead in terms of any vehicles you'll be replacing. This isn't explicitly mentioned here, but of course there also needs to be a shift in how we use diesel generators, so moving to mains grid connections for events and battery power, and a limited use of alternative fuels. So there's also reducing food waste and healthier diet, so a shift away from meat and how we might be able to support that culturally through the kind of food we serve in our spaces and at our events. And then there are solutions such as afforestation and supporting tree planting, which you can see in the land use arrow. So this one we start to look at some of the more difficult areas such as aviation. So constrained demand growth for aviation. It basically means that we can't carry on flying in the way that we are now. We have to think really carefully about when we fly and why. And reducing waste overall is a really big one for the next 10 years. So sending no biodegradable waste to landfill by 2025, so no food, paper, card, plant or other organic waste to landfill, getting systems in place to deal with those waste streams. So government can set the overall trajectory with policy that helps make these changes happen, but more than half of the emissions reductions we need will require some change from people and impact the way that we live, like the shift to electric vehicles, for example. Of course, the choices like what we eat, for example, eating less meat, can open up more land for reforestation. And if demand for flying reduces, then that means more ambitious emissions reductions are possible. So culturally, there's a a huge opportunity for the arts sector here in helping shift the barriers to what people will accept, and in helping to model some of these shifts and make them more real to achieve those large societal or behavioural changes. So some of the main drivers for change are legislation such as the Climate Change Act and those other pieces of policy that we've already spoken about. These have binding emissions reduction targets. There are regulations as well, such as the Arts Council England's Environmental Reporting Programme. There are the climate emergency movements and how local authorities will translate their climate emergency declarations into practice. There's public pressure and the huge social awareness that we've seen growing in the last few years. For example, the school strikes for climate. The school strike, these are our current and future audiences. There's also the economic argument, so areas such as energy efficiency and better use of resources help to save money. There will also be investments to make sure where capital investments are made now, they're fit for the future. There's also international pressure from our teams and workforce who are worried about the climate crisis and want to do something. And at the heart of that, ethics. What does it mean for the arts to be a driver for good in the world in the context of the climate crisis? How does it shift our social contract when we consider how to build a society within the ecological boundaries of our planet? So, what are the possible roles for culture and the arts? Culture and the arts form a vital part of the human experience in everyday life. They bring communities together, empower, educate and inspire, motivate citizenship, activism and drive positive change. They're a catalyst for innovation, testing new ways of working, new models, new technologies, using our creativity to find solutions to some sustainability issues. The arts and culture are a key part of our economy with potential to influence, and places such as venues, museums, libraries, events are all physical hubs and spaces which can reduce impacts and role model low carbon infrastructure. So it's worth thinking about those things which you can directly control. So for example, what kind of electricity you use to power your buildings, whether you invest in energy efficiency technologies or energy management for buildings. Then it's worth thinking about those things which you can influence, such as audience travel, audience perceptions on climate change through environmental programming of work, for example. And then there are the things that your suppliers invest in. And then there are the larger scale issues which are harder to control. So investment in public transport infrastructure, for example. Focusing on those issues at the centre first will help you to increase your positive action. So zero carbon culture, what does this mean? It means less energy and zero carbon energy sources for building and events. A circular creative economy, replacing the take, make, dispose model with one which designs out waste and maximises resource value. Sustainable and zero carbon travel and transport, less meat and dairy, and working with local and regional policymakers to support net zero carbon plans. We're now going to go through some principles for taking action and translating this action into your work. The emphasis will depend on what your role is, so keep those spheres of influence that we just talked about at the forefront of your mind as we go through these discussions. And if you have an organisational strategy or policy, look at the priorities within that and work out how your department can support it. If you don't have one, start with your own department and go and speak to others in your organisation. So often we'll find that different departments like facilities, marketing and programming aren't speaking to each other, which means a lot of opportunities are missed. So first of all, if we start with commit, this is about establishing what your goals are and what you really want to achieve. It can be useful to align these to kind of policy such as zero carbon by 2050. Have a real think about what it is that your organisation wants to achieve, and from there you can develop a policy and action plan. And within that plan you can embed sustainability and decision-making processes such as procurement or day-to-day work actions. You can start to engage with your teams and recruit green champions, and also perhaps designate a budget to your green programme. So next you want to understand. So this is about looking at what's happening, and this will help you to focus on where you need to take action as well. So measuring and monitoring impacts, carrying out surveys, for example building energy audits or audience travel surveys to get the data on where you can make these reductions and get a context of the bigger picture. Next we move into the improve stage. So that's translating this data into meaningful action. Looking at what you can do to achieve impact reductions and evaluating your performance on an ongoing basis against your targets and plans. And then there's communication. Talk about what you're doing, talk to your audiences, get their ideas, make it visible and felt, and activate people for action, getting everybody on board. If you ever get lost, there are some principles that you can always come back to, such as the spheres for control that we just spoke about, but also this is a really valuable hierarchy for action which can translate across a number of impact areas. So number one in the hierarchy is to measure, to understand and report on your impact and how you're doing year by year. Figure out what information is meaningful and how you're going to track it, but don't go overboard. Start with the high level impacts, and then as time goes on you can start to expand and gather more complex data if you find that it's necessary. Secondly, avoid emissions if you can by doing things differently. So this could mean including changing your business models, avoiding unnecessary meetings, for example carrying out meetings over Skype rather than flying or driving. Number three is reducing emissions by increasing efficiency. So this is energy efficiency, such as energy efficiency of your buildings or the technologies that you use. And number four is replacing high carbon energy sources with low carbon energy sources. For example, signing up to a renewable energy supplier would be a really good example of that. Or having on-site renewables. So number five, very much the last part of the hierarchy, is when you've done everything you can in the first four stages of the hierarchy, you can then move on to offsetting your emissions, which can't be eliminated through the other stages. So only do this as a last resort, and if you're confident that you're also managing and reducing your carbon footprint in other ways. So there are a number of ways to approach offsetting, and we're actually releasing a guide on this very soon. But there's also, just very briefly, there's official offset, so you can do it through an offset provider that already exists, or a kind of DIY approach. So you might like to ring fence a carbon contribution to investment in a project such as staff training in sustainability, or increasing biodiversity on your site, or through a local charity. So this slide basically shows how everybody has a role to play within your organisation and this movement. Everyone kind of needs to be on the same page and understand the plan and how each area fits together. So for example, if I take for example operations, that would be the action plans for day-to-day energy and resource management, data collection, sharing learnings inside and outside of the organisation, and that leads down to areas such as food and beverage, so increasing plant-based menu options, reducing and eliminating waste, working with suppliers, production and design. Consider at the start when you're putting your designs together, what's going to happen to things at the end of life. So how can you reduce material usage and wastage? Can you design things to be reused or reassembled or repurposed, or perhaps used in a different department within your organisation? And we spoke about marketing and communications and the importance of telling your environmental story. Offer incentives and rewards either to staff that are getting involved in your environmental movement or to your audiences, and celebrate your successes, which is hugely important. Okay, here are some top tips and some food for thought. So first of all, do your research, but don't get caught up in trying to make everything perfect from the outset. This can be the enemy of action and kind of lead to stalling and getting stuck. You've got to recognise that this is a process and a journey, and you've got to start somewhere. Ask some follow-up questions to identify greenwashing. For example, if a product has a sticker on it saying it's environmentally friendly, how exactly is it environmentally friendly? If something says it's biodegradable, for example biodegradable plastics, are they truly biodegradable, or are they only biodegradable in, for example, industrial conditions? If something says it's recyclable, check to see if it's actually recyclable with your local authority before you purchase hundreds of that item. So it's about being honest, open and accountable. So data is the thing that really helps to keep us accountable. Are we really reducing impacts? Be open and share with others in the sector what's working for you and what hasn't worked. We often learn from others what has gone wrong, and also some of those we might be tackling the same problems and be able to share some solutions. So lastly, fundraising and budgets. Start building them in. So having a ring-fenced green fund is great, but it's as important as aligning your existing projects and budgets. So putting climate and environment at the heart of our business means it also has to be there across the board, rather than seeing it as just an obligation or an extra thing that we have to deal with. We can see it as the awesome creative challenge that is to realign what we are for and how we serve our communities in a way that takes the climate crisis on board. Whoops, oh, sorry, got carried away. So there are lots of places that you can go to find answers and support. Our website, our Judys Bicycle website, is absolutely brimming with all sorts of resources that can help you get started and lead you through your journey. So the Creative Green tools are a brilliant starting point for measuring your impacts. There are free carbon calculators for venues, festivals, tours, offices, are bespoke to the arts and cultural sector that we have developed, and they can help you start to track your impacts and to look at those impacts year on year. We also have tons of guides. You can just use the search function if there's a particular thing that you're interested in, for example sustainable production, audience travel, and we have podcasts. All of our webinars are also in the resource section of our website, so there's plenty there to help get you started. We've also just launched something called the Creative Climate Chats with Judys Bicycle, so that every Wednesday from 4:30. We've had conversations recently with Lucy Davies from the Royal Court Theatre about green recovery and a just transition, and Chaitanya Kumar from the New Economics Foundation has also been one of our guests. So do have a look at what's coming up and sign up, and please do join us for one of those. We also have Season for Change, which is an opportunity to join a UK-wide movement It's a season of creative programming celebrating the environment and inspiring action on climate change. It's run by JB and Arts Admin. If you're interested in organising an event or putting something on, digital events of course are welcome to the end of the year. So we have a specific website for that, which is the Season for Change website. And we have our Colour Green podcast. This features Baroness Lola Young in conversation with artists and activists of colour on climate justice, race, power and inequality. The podcasts use green spaces of the artist's choosing as a starting point for each conversation, and they're definitely worth having a listen to. They're also available on our website. I'm just going to finish off now with some inspiration, so stories from the sector. These are organisations and how they're responding to the challenges. So the Royal Court Theatre are a really brilliant example. They've put a credible plan together for a just transition to become a net zero venue through 2020. They already procure 100% renewable energy from Good Energy and carbon neutral gas from Ecotricity. They've had things like reducing meat on the menu from 47% to 25% and favouring less carbon intensive meats and fish. They've achieved zero waste to landfill. They've put a policy in place of having no flights within the mainland UK, and for the any flights or international travel that they do take, they've created a decision matrix to take into account price, time, carbon and time spent at the destination. They're going to evaluate their progress in 2020 and then look at remaining emissions to be offset. The Horniman Museum and Gardens, they have a target to become greenhouse gas neutral by 2040. The Horniman has the lovely benefit of having the green spaces that bring together the museum and the outdoors. So they had a project, Nature and Love, to redisplay natural history and living collections around ecological and climate themes. They've recruited a climate and ecological action coordinator. They've done a lot of programming, environmentally themed programming, and have planting schemes for biodiversity within those gardens. So MAST, which stands for the Manchester Arts Sustainability Team, are working as a network towards Manchester City's zero carbon 2038 roadmap. So MAST are a network of 27 arts and cultural organisations, from community-based art centres and iconic cultural venues to internationally renowned festival and national broadcasters. They've got a lot to celebrate since they were founded in 2011. They've really made great emissions reductions, avoided I think £890,000 in energy costs, and a third of the members are now generating or purchasing low or zero carbon energy. A wide range of partnerships are part of this group, and They have things like a city carbon literacy programme, through to partnerships with individual members and organisations such as Transport for Greater Manchester and the National Trust. I'm just going to whip through because we're starting to run out of time, and I want to make sure there's plenty of time for everyone to ask questions. I'll just briefly cover Shambala Festival as a case study. So Shambala have done a huge amount as over the years and taken action in their own operations, including on energy, so switching to waste vegetable oil biofuels. They were one of the first events in the UK to switch to reusable cups, and they've been running their own Bring a Bottle campaign now for over 5 years. In 2016 they took the bold decision to go entirely meat and fish free. This wasn't something that they took lightly. They had to think very carefully about how to communicate it with their audiences, as 70% of audiences were meat eaters. So they wanted to make a big splash and to provoke conversation about the environmental impact and the reasons behind it. Even the wording was very carefully chosen. So, for example, rather than saying vegetarian or vegan, they chose to say meat-free and fish-free. They also have prepared a lot of information and lengthy question and answer section on their website about their choices and the science behind diet and climate change, and also were ready and on hand on social media to answer people's questions. As part of the programme, they also have had they hosted talks and workshops and put a lot of effort into booking as many different exciting traders as possible to encourage people to try something new. In a post-festival survey, they actually found that 77% wanted the festival to stay meat and fish free, which is quite amazing considering the percentage of people that were meat eaters. And over 50% of meat eaters that took the survey had changed their diet and reduced their consumption after the festival. The Lambeth Country Show is another organisation that have really committed to sustainability through a number of policies which modelling sustainable behaviour and engaging the community on how they can reduce their resource consumption. So they use at least 70% seasonal and local ingredients. All the traders use compostable plates and cutlery and cups. Any fish has to be MSC certified, and all of the traders have an environmental policy or waste management strategy in place, and 90% of them pay London living wage as well. And it's a nice example of how working within an area can demonstrate solutions which can be scaled up to other councils or areas in the city. This example here, Toby Peach, he's an independent theatre maker and alumni of our Creative Climate Leadership course, and he's drafted the Principles of Peach, a document he shares with venues and companies he interacts with to start a conversation around sustainability. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead now so that we have some time, plenty of time for questions. But just before we move on to those, I'd like everyone to just take a minute to write down one thing that you are going to do when you go back to work, and write down something from this presentation you're going to speak to somebody about, and decide who that person is going to be. If you can also put this on your calendar now, so to remind you to review it again in a month's time to check that you've done it and make yourself accountable. Or again, you could put in your calendar a kind of reflection moment to think about what you've achieved and what you want to do next and what your next step is. I'm just going to give you a few seconds to do that. Okay. I'd now like to ask you what topic you'd most like to see us address in a future deep dive webinar. So the poll should now be up on your screen. So the choices are making sense of environmental data, writing an environmental policy and action plan. There's a few different choices for you to choose from. Okay, we've got nearly all of our votes in now, just a few more people to go. Brilliant. Okay. So a lot of people there have said they would like writing an environmental policy and action plan. So we'll combine those results with the responses we got from the webinar last week, and we will be announcing very soon what the next topic will be. So thank you very much for giving us your thoughts. So that brings us now on to question and answer. So please do, if you've got any questions, and please do put them into the question and answer box rather than the chat box. And I'm going to welcome Chiara to join us and help answer some of the questions.
Hi, thanks so much for that, Becky, and thanks for all of you. We've got some great questions that are coming through already, so please do keep adding them. So we have a first one from Malik, who's asked us to be a bit clearer about what we mean about pre-industrial level. And the question is also, in today's parlance, when one says it's 30 degrees Celsius warm, how does that compare or relate to pre-industrial level? So pre-industrial means very loosely before the Industrial Revolution. That's when we started burning loads of fossil fuels in our factories and for transport and so on and so forth. When scientists use the term, when they talk about temperatures, they actually use a period of quite a few years to calculate an average against which to measure change. And the reason they use a period of quite a few years is to account for changes between individual years. As you all know, sometimes we have hot years, sometimes we have cold years. So scientists basically look at that and they go, okay, let's choose a number of years and use the average there. So, and also because the further back you go, we have a less complete temperature record. So, for example, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they use 1850 to 1900 as a reference period to measure temperature changes against. And they measure warming using a 30-year global average of air temperatures across the world, so across land and across water. So again, this is about the average across the whole globe. So for your question of, you know, if it's 30 degrees warm here today, it's not that it was exactly 28.5 or 29 degrees warm 200 years ago. It's more that, for example, over a summer, it's more likely for there to have been more days that are more than 30 degrees Celsius in the UK than there would have been over a summer 200 or so years ago. I hope that makes sense. And the reason that also matters is because a lot of the way that we build our buildings and we run our buildings and the way we live our lives is sort of adapted to what the average temperatures are. which is why here in the UK we have central heating, but we don't have air conditioning, for example. In quite a lot of bits of Europe, we don't tend to have air conditioning, which means if average temperatures go up and we have more than a certain number of days that go over 30 degrees and more, then our whole built environment and the way that we live isn't really adapted to that. And particularly those of you running venues might have already come up against this in some of the really hot summers that we've had in the last few years, where suddenly the air conditioning or the ventilation systems in your venues just weren't ever built or designed to deal with the number of really hot days that we have now, and it means audiences end up being uncomfortable and so on and so forth. When we're talking about pre-industrial concentrations of carbon in the atmosphere, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we are slightly less dependent on some of those longer term averages because they were really stable for a long time at around 280 parts per million. So parts per million is how you measure how much carbon dioxide there is in the atmosphere. And that over the past 800,000 years, we haven't really gone over 280 parts per million. If anything, we've gone below. And we're now at about 410 parts per million. So that's the difference between the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere between pre-industrial times, so before we started burning loads of fossil fuels, and now. I hope that answers the question. There's another question about what the ocean layer is and how it comes into play with climate change action plans, which I am not sure I am fully clear on, but the ocean does have different layers. I think there's about 5 that are defined differently, but and between which water moves based on our currents and so on and so forth. And that means, but the main thing that the ocean does is, because it's this huge body of water, again, it helps regulate the temperature on the planet. And what scientists have found is that actually the ocean has been absorbing a lot more heat, a lot more of this extra heat in the world than we thought. So the top layer of the ocean absorbs the heat, then through various currents, that heat is actually brought into the deeper layers of the ocean, and the ocean absorbs more heat from the top. So there's almost, for a while, scientists weren't sure why maybe the Earth was heating up less, and it's because all of it has gone into the ocean. And then a question about how meat consumption affects climate change. So there's a few different ways. One, as we touched on very briefly, is that certain animals that we eat for meat that are called ruminants, which includes cows, for example, they chew up grass and then it sort of sits in their stomachs where it stays for a long time as it gets broken down, where it releases methane, and then they fart out the methane. And methane is a really strong greenhouse gas. So that's one way that meat consumption helps drive climate change. Again, in some ways, because methane is short-lived, the reason that methane matters is because it can drive us over certain tipping points, but it does stick around in the atmosphere less long than the carbon dioxide that we're putting in there from burning fossil fuels. The other way that us eating meat affects climate change is because it takes a lot more land to raise animals, because you need the land that the animals are on, and you need to farm the land where you grow the food that you feed the animals. And through that, when we eat more meat, we're using more land for agriculture, which means we're driving more emissions of nitrous oxide from the fertilizer and stuff that we use in the fields. We're driving more climate change through land use change. So when we cut down forests and rainforests to make space for cows and other meats. So those are the ways in which our meat consumption drives climate change. And that's one of the reasons why scientists are keen that one of the things we do is reduce how much meat we eat, as one of the solutions that we need out of all of the ones that we need. We've got a question about action in particularly ballet in the UK, and that is a really good question that I don't know whether Becky knows a little bit more. We know that we work very closely with Sadler's Wells as a dance venue, and they have done a lot across the board on driving climate action, and we have also worked with New Adventures as a touring company who have pioneered our Creative Green certification for touring. We can, as part of the follow-up to this webinar, circulate some of the case studies from New Adventures and also Sadler's Wells. Do we have any more questions? And if not, that is also fine.
Just give a couple more seconds if anyone does have anything.
Oh.
Does deforestation affect climate change?
Yes, it does. So deforestation affects climate change in a couple of ways. Trees and any plants basically are, like most living things, in part made up of carbon. So what trees and plants do is very clever. They absorb energy from the sun and they use water to what is called in scientific terms fix carbon dioxide. So they take it out of the air and they turn it into things like sugars and whatever else that become the plants. So in all these trees and all these plants, you have a lot of carbon that they've locked up and stored. And also in the soil, there is a lot of carbon that's locked up there. And when we cut down the trees start decomposing, which then releases carbon dioxide that, again, they've locked up for quite a long time. We disturb the soil, which also releases carbon dioxide. And it means that we no longer have the trees that are out there busy taking carbon dioxide out of the air to grow. So there's kind of three ways in which deforestation drives climate change. And one of the reasons why we want to be planting more trees, although, again, it can't be the only thing that we do.
Okay, if we don't have any more questions, then thank you very much to Chiara for joining us for question and answer, and also to Farah, who's been working away in the background. And thank you all very much for joining us. We will be sending out slides and recordings to everybody, and there will also be a recording available on our website. So we look forward to hopefully seeing you at the next session. Thank you.